Hi everyone, my name is Leah Kopke and I'm a 3D motion design freelancer. I also have a podcast where each week I cover another 3D modeling tool for Cinema 4D. Hello and welcome. Today we're going to go over the globalized Symmetry tool for Cinema 4D. This tool is replacing the old sculpting Symmetry tool as well as the generator Symmetry tool. So let's go ahead and jump into Cinema 4D and talk a little bit how this works for both your 3D modeling mesh tools as well as your sculpting tools. Let's get started. So here we are inside of Cinema 4D. Let's just start off with talking a little bit about where you can find this tool. You can find your Enable Symmetry here. When you activate it, it will turn this purple color. We also have this gear over here where you can see all of your settings for your Symmetry tool in here. And this is called the Symmetry Hub. If you click this pen here, it'll keep it open, which I find really helpful as we go through this. This checkbox Symmetry will turn this tool on and off. You can see this highlighting and turning off up here, changing colors. You have this option to show planes. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about how this tool works by dropping in a cube here as an example. I'll change our view from garage shading to garage shading lines, and I'll increase our segments in the X, Y, and Z to 2 so that we have this symmetrical. We won't see our planes for our Symmetry tool, although it's turned on, until we, number 1, make this editable using the C hotkey, and number 2, switch to one of our modeling modes like polygons, edges, or points. So we need to be in one of these modes here in order to see these changes happening. So let's talk about planar mode. So planar mode will use your planes in the X, Y, or Z direction in order to create symmetry. Right now we have our X plane checked on, so you can see our X plane. If we have no planes checked on, you won't see any. So if we use the hotkey MT for extrude, and we extrude this polygon, right now it's not symmetrical. So I'll hit undo. We could make this symmetrical in the X direction by turning on the X plane. And now you can see we're keeping symmetry in the X plane. We could do this for the Y, and now you'll see Y is represented by this green plane. And when I extrude this, it extrudes it symmetrically along the Y. When we turn on Z, we'll see the Z plane is this purplish blue, and when we extrude, it respects that plane there. You can have multiples of these turned on at once, and it will update accordingly. So that's really good to be aware of for right now as you 3D model symmetrical objects. So that's our first option there, is planar. Something important to keep in mind is that as I'm using the extrude, that's considered a mesh modeling tool. So this is accommodating the modeling tool settings. We have this option of context. By default, it's set to auto, and this works most of the time. But you do have slightly different settings for your mesh modeling tools, like what we're using now, versus your sculpting options. So in sculpting, you'll see you still have your X, Y, and Z planes you can use. And in both the modeling and sculpting options, you have the option of what space you're using to determine the X, Y, and Z planes. So you'll see the space gives you the option of local. That'll use the local axis of the object you're 3D modeling on to determine the location of the X, Y, and Z planes. You could use global. That will utilize the axis of your origin for the X, Y, and Z of the planes. Work plane, you can move your work plane to any location you'd like. I have a whole episode on this, and I'll use the work plane as a reference for your planes. And that's for both sculpting and modeling. You'll see you have the space option here. So your tolerance option is if you have an object that isn't perfectly symmetrical, you can choose a tolerance or an error threshold that will allow you to select and make changes, and it will have a higher tolerance for perhaps that error in symmetry here so they can continue working. So you can adjust this here. And those are the main settings for planar, for both sculpting and modeling in here. You can also set a custom space. This is just for the modeling option. You can choose a position and a rotation, or you can pick an object as your reference, and I'll use that to determine the location of these 3 planes. So that's an option there as well. Let's go ahead and move on to topology. So for topology, I'm going to open up a new project to represent this. If I open up our asset browser over here, you can see that I was searching for character, but what you want to do is you want to search for character. And the reason why I'm using an asset from in here for this is because I know you'll have it too, because if you have a license, you'll have access to all the same things I do here. So I'll just double click on this character here, this cartoon character of a woman, to show how the planar, to show how the topology option works, since we've covered planar. So let's go ahead and take a look at our model here. You can see that the artist that built this, they had locked the mesh part of this character. So I'm going to actually go ahead and unlock the mesh part of this character. And I'm going to put her in a different position. I'm going to move her arm down. Maybe her hand could be placed on her hips or something like that. Roughly there. It doesn't need to be exact. This is just an example for what you could do. And maybe she is waving at the camera. So I'll go ahead and move her arm into place. I want her elbow to be moved inwards a little bit. There we go. That looks like it's the pull for her arm. I'll rotate this around. She has one hand on her hip and she's waving at the camera to everyone. So this character is no longer symmetrical, as you can see here. And if we go ahead and bake her down to be no longer rig, just a mesh. So I'm going to actually right click on this character and I'm going to say current state to object. Oh, we kept the, I'm going to actually undo that, because that didn't quite bake the way that I wanted it to. We may just because it also kept all the controls, and I just want her to be a baked down mesh. So I have an idea for this. I'm going to turn her around. I really only need the mesh and the accessories, so I'll actually right click on these two and choose current state to object. And once we do that, we'll get copies of this. And I'll just move our copy of this model over. And I'm going to delete these constraint tags. So this is a little bit of a longer process than what I thought it would be to make this no longer a rigged character and just to be baked into this position. But here we go. We have her all set up over here. So my main point is that she is no longer symmetrical, but we have this mesh over here. And what if we want to give her a bracelet in this baked down state where she's no longer rigged, and we don't want to go through the trouble of re-rigging this character just so that we can make her symmetrical again along the X, Y, or Z planes. That's what topology is for. So let's click on the topology button over here. We have two options on how we determine the center of this mesh. We have the edge and the polygon. So you want to select a loop down the center of this model. So we can take a look at this and perhaps use the edge. So I'll use UL for loop selection while selecting the main mesh of this character. Here we are. I might go ahead and just move these out of there so that it feels more organized. So I have this model here. We need to find a center point. So this looks like it's the center of the mesh, this loop right here. So now I'm going to click Define Selection. We are defining the center. You can also do this with a polygon loop, but you can see that the edge is much more centered than what a polygon loop looks like it would be. So for this case, it makes more sense to use an edge, but in some cases, it might make more sense to use a polygon loop. But once you select the center with either of these options, you click this button. And once you've done that, if you select a loop on one side, it should select the loop on the other side. But first we need to turn on symmetry. Now that we have symmetry on, you can see that it is selected on both sides. So if we want to give her a bracelet at this point, I can select 3 on that side, select 3 on that side, and now we can extrude this with MT or the extrude button, and here we go. It has a bracelet, and we can give this a nice little bevel around it if we want to. And this will update on both arms of the mesh if we want it to remain symmetrical. I'm using MS to enable the bevel tool. I'll give this some subdivisions. I've covered all of these tools in the past, so you can find them in my podcast on earlier lessons. I'll also leave them in the description in case if you're interested in checking them out. The bevel tool and the extrude tool. So now she has a bracelet and she's symmetrical along her topology instead of a plane. So that's how that works. Let's go on to the next option, which is radial symmetry. And by the way, for sculpting, you'll see that there isn't that topology option in here, but it is available for the modeling. But they both have the radial symmetry option. So if you switch between modeling and symmetry, see the options vary a little bit, but there's a lot of overlap. So let's talk first about modeling with radial symmetry. I'm going to actually do this in a new scene. Let's drop in a cylinder. Our cylinder has 16 rotation segments, and we're going to turn on lines. We need to do a couple of things before we can see our radial symmetry working. The first thing you need to do is make sure you have an editable object. This is not editable, so we'll use the C hotkey or this button down here to make it editable. That's step one to being able to see your planes. The next is to turn on symmetry. And then the next after that is make sure show planes is showing. And then the final step is make sure you are in one of these modeling modes here. So that's points, edges, polygons. Once you're in those modes, you can now use radial symmetry. So let's talk a little bit about this. We're going to go over this mirror option a little bit later, so I'm going to turn it off for right now. You can choose to use radial symmetry around the X, around the Y, and around the Z. We're going to use the Y because it makes sense for a cylinder. That's the direction in which it is already radially symmetrical. You can choose the number of slices you have. I'm going to choose 8 because 8 is half of 16, and 16 is the number of rotation segments we have on this. So if I do this, I can go ahead and extrude this radially, and it's extruding this radially among the 8 slices. You can offset the rotation here by moving this and choosing a number of degrees. I'll set this back to default. You'll notice that only one of these slices has this arrow looking object next to it, and what this is determining is your source slice. This is our source slice. If we change our source slice from 0 to 1, this will be your source slice. So what is your source slice? It's a great question. This is used to calculate radial symmetry when you're using a different symmetry tool called Symmetrize. That is quite the tongue twister to say symmetry and symmetrize so many times in a sentence. But this is determining what's your main slice that you would like to rotate along this entire object. So right now it's choosing this one here. If I turn off symmetry just to make this asymmetrical, and I'm just going to extrude this, oh no, it's no longer symmetrical. What if we wanted it to be symmetrical? Well, we turn on symmetry, and we still have our arrow over here. And we have our source slice as this slice here. So what we do is we go into the mesh menu, and then we go into our clone menu, because symmetry is just another form of cloning when you think about it. And you'll see this option Symmetrize here. It has a gear icon next to it, which means it has additional options. We're going to use the radial symmetry, and you'll see that our source slice matches in both of these. So we're going to use our source slice, and we're going to hit OK. And now it is symmetrical because we used the Symmetrize tool with radial as the option. This kind of looks like a windmill. Anywho, so that is how radial symmetry works. That's what your source slice is. That's what your slice count is. What is mirror? Well, that is a good question. So if you turn on mirror, it'll mirror each one of these slices. So I'm actually going to reduce this to 4 as our slice count. And then we have our mirror on. So the mirror is the purple plane, and then the slice is the red plane. So you'll see that if I click on one of these, it's mirroring what is happening in that slice along this plane. So it's almost like you have symmetry inside of symmetry happening, because it is first creating that radial symmetry, and then it is cutting each one of those radial symmetry slices and mirroring each side of that slice. So that is what is creating that effect. And then you can 3D model with this turned on. So that is our symmetry. And let's go ahead and talk about what radial symmetry is for when you are sculpting. But that basically covers it for modeling. So let's go ahead and open up a new project. We're going to drop in a lovely sphere into here, and I'll change our mode from standard to hexahedron. With our hexahedron in here, we need to be able to see its edges, so I'll change this to garage shading lines. I'll increase the segments to 100. The reason why I'm using a hexahedron is because it's made up of all quads. And I think it makes for a nice base mesh for sculpting because of that. Now I'm going to make this editable with the C hotkey, so now we can use the sculpting tools on it, and let's go ahead and switch into sculpting mode. Now once I do that, our symmetry tools will automatically close, so I'll just go ahead and reopen those. I'll subdivide this, and now we have a sphere with a sculpting tag attached to it. We can turn on our symmetry. You can sculpt as you'd expect with all the things we've talked about for the modeling tools, and that means the planes and such. You can see this is symmetrical on both sides, but we're going to talk a little bit about radial symmetry because that's a little bit different. So I'm going to turn off this plane, and we're going to talk about radial symmetry. So we'll use the XY plane for the radial symmetry. You can increase the number of strokes. That's kind of like your slices that were there in the other case. So you can go ahead and do this. Let's subdivide this further for fun. Okay, so we have 13 here. And we can just draw on the sphere. I think this would be really fun for 3D modeling pottery, to make all these interesting symmetrical types of shapes on it. So you can choose your number of strokes, that's 13 strokes, and you can choose your direction. So that was the XY, you can choose the YZ, and you can see this goes the other way. You can choose the ZX. You can also choose a custom point. Now I think this is interesting because in theory you should be able to go into point mode, and you should be able to right click on here, they say in the manual, and when you right click on a point in here, with custom point on, it's supposed to use that point for symmetry. When sculpting. I'm going to go in our layer manager. So I'll go back into model mode. But it's never updated for me when I did that. And that's what they say to do in the instruction manual, is to adjust the point there. So that's never really worked for me. If you have it work for you, I'm really interested to know how you do it. And please let me know in the comments below if you figure that out. But I have a hack for this that works. So the idea is you can use one of these planes to sculpt. But this custom place to sculpt has never worked for me. So what I like to do is I like to, you can basically bake down this shape, say current state to object. And once you do that, you'll get an editable version of this mesh. I'm going to move this over. Now, you'll lose all of your sculpting layers doing this, but what you'll gain in return is the ability to use enable axis. And then you can rotate this. You can rotate your axis any direction you'd like. And then once you've done that, you've also, in return, updated the point in which you can use symmetry. So that is one way to do that, but you do lose all of your layers when you do that. So there's definitely some pros and cons to it. But if you make a copy, you can always go back to the original if you'd like to, and have all of your layers still here, as well as your levels for sculpting. You can also choose a gap angle. So let's talk a little bit about what this gap angle is. And it creates a gap between your strokes. So I'll go back into the draw tool, and maybe I'll choose this one. So that creates quite a different effect. And I think that this is really fun to play with, actually, to just try out different effects and see what they look like. It's a fun tool. That's how that works. And that just about covers all the settings for sculpting with Radial on. We covered everything, and I hope you found this very helpful. I had a lot of fun going over Symmetry with you. It's definitely one of the more confusing tools. It's nice that they simplified it and improved upon the old versions by making it all globalized, so that when you learn Symmetry for modeling, you've also learned it for sculpting. It really makes things a lot simpler in that way to have one globalized tool for it. So I think that's better. I hope you found this helpful. I go over another 3D modeling tool each week. We've covered all the mesh modeling tools, and we've covered most of the sculpting tools. So I hope you'll stay tuned for the next episode, and I look forward to seeing you then.